January 1944. Pearl Harbor Logistics Command, Hawaii. The war in the Pacific had already stretched across half the world. From the American West Coast to the scattered islands of the Central Pacific, ships moved constantly across the ocean. Tankers carried fuel. Cargo vessels hauled ammunition. Transport aircraft crossed thousands of miles of open water. Every crate, every engine part, every box of medical supplies had to arrive at the right island at the right moment. Inside a long, brightly lit operations room overlooking Pearl Harbor, rows of desks were filled with maps, ledgers, and stacks of typed reports. The sound of typewriters echoed steadily across the floor. Uniformed personnel studied shipping schedules and cargo lists. Many of them were women. Members of the Women's Army Corps and the U.S. Navy Waves worked quietly among the logistics staff. They tracked supply requests from distant airfields, coordinated shipping manifests, and organized the endless flow of equipment feeding the American war effort across the Pacific. Thousands of miles away, Japanese intelligence officers studying captured reports were beginning to realize something unexpected. The immense American supply network keeping the Pacific War alive was not only powered by factories and ships. It was also being organized, calculated, and managed by women. And that realization would raise a larger question about how the United States had mobilized its entire society for war. December 7th, 1941. Just after sunrise, waves of aircraft from the Empire of Japan struck the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Battleships burned in the harbor. Airfields were wrecked. Nearly the entire Pacific Fleet had been caught at anchor. Within hours, the United States understood that the war would not be brief. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress and declared war. Across the country, millions of Americans began preparing for a conflict that would soon stretch across oceans and continents. Factories shifted almost overnight. Automobile plants stopped producing civilian cars and began manufacturing tanks, trucks, and aircraft engines. Steel mills increased output. Shipyards expanded along both coasts. But industrial mobilization created a problem that few planners had fully anticipated. Millions of American men were entering military service. By 1942, soldiers, sailors, and pilots were leaving farms, factories, and offices at a pace unmatched in the nation's history. Entire industries suddenly faced severe labor shortages. Assembly lines that once relied on experienced male workers were now missing a large portion of their workforce. The American government responded by turning to a resource that had long been underused in heavy industry and military administration: women. In early 1942, recruitment campaigns began encouraging women to step into jobs that had previously been dominated by men. Posters appeared in cities and towns across the United States. Newspapers described the national need for workers. Radio broadcasts called for volunteers. Women began entering factories in enormous numbers. They worked in aircraft assembly plants in Seattle and Los Angeles. They welded ship hulls in yards along the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. They built engines, packed ammunition, inspected aircraft parts, and drove trucks that carried military supplies across the country. At the same time, the armed forces recognized that women could also perform many essential non-combat roles within the military itself. In 1942, the United States established the Women's Army Corps. The organization allowed women to serve in uniform while performing administrative, technical, and logistical duties that kept the Army functioning. The Navy soon followed with the creation of the Waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service. Women joining these organizations did not fight on the front lines. Instead, they filled positions that were vital to the military's growing logistical network. They operated communication systems, handled personnel records, managed transportation schedules, and maintained the flow of information between bases and commands. This administrative work might have appeared distant from combat. In reality, it formed the backbone of modern warfare. World War II was not only a contest of armies. It was also a contest of production, transportation, and supply. Tanks and aircraft required constant maintenance. Ships consumed enormous quantities of fuel. Soldiers depended on steady shipments of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Every item had to be manufactured, transported, recorded, and delivered through a complex chain of logistics. As American forces expanded across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters, that chain grew longer and more complicated. In offices filled with maps, filing cabinets, and radio equipment, thousands of women began managing pieces of that expanding system. Their work was rarely visible on the battlefield, but without it, the battlefield itself could not function. And nowhere would this logistical challenge become more demanding than in the vast distances of the Pacific War. The war against Imperial Japan was unlike any conflict the United States had ever fought before. Across the Pacific Ocean stretched thousands of miles of open water. Islands were scattered across the sea like distant outposts, often separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles. For American commanders, geography itself became one of the greatest challenges of the war. A soldier fighting in Europe might receive supplies delivered by rail or truck from factories only a few hundred miles away. In the Pacific, the situation was entirely different. Almost everything needed by American forces had to travel across an ocean. Fuel, ammunition, aircraft parts, medical equipment, construction materials, food, and fresh water all had to move through a chain of bases that stretched westward from the American mainland. The journey often began in major supply centers along the U.S. West Coast. Ports in San Francisco, Seattle, and San Diego loaded cargo ships with military equipment destined for the Pacific Theater. From there, convoys sailed toward intermediate bases, especially Hawaii, which became the central logistical hub of the American war effort in the Pacific. At massive depots near Pearl Harbor, cargo was unloaded, sorted, repacked, and redirected to forward bases closer to combat zones. Some shipments continued west toward the Marshall Islands, the Gilbert Islands, and later the Mariana Islands. Each step required careful planning. Every cargo vessel had a limited amount of space. Aircraft carriers required spare parts. Fighter squadrons needed ammunition and replacement engines. Marine units preparing for amphibious assaults required landing craft, engineering equipment, and vast quantities of fuel. A mistake in scheduling or inventory could leave an entire operation without essential supplies. To manage this complex network, the United States developed an enormous administrative system within the military. Under the direction of the U.S. Army Service Forces, logistics officers tracked thousands of shipments, moving simultaneously across the Pacific. But the scale of the system quickly outgrew the number of available personnel. By 1943, the United States military was operating dozens of major supply bases across the Pacific Theater. Each base generated an endless flow of paperwork, cargo manifests, shipping schedules, maintenance reports, and supply requests. This administrative work had to be processed quickly and accurately. In offices in Honolulu, California, and Washington, thousands of uniformed women working in the Women's Army Corps and the WAVES, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, became an essential part of this logistical system. They tracked supply inventories using ledgers and filing systems that recorded the movement of equipment across entire theaters of war. They typed and transmitted orders directing ships where to sail. They coordinated transportation schedules for aircraft and naval convoys. A shipment of aircraft engines leaving California might pass through several offices managed by these personnel before reaching its destination on a distant island airfield. In many cases, the success of a military operation depended on the accuracy of their work. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence officers were carefully studying American supply activity across the Pacific. Reconnaissance reports, intercepted communications, and captured documents revealed something increasingly difficult to ignore. The American war effort was not only powered by factories and warships. Behind the front lines existed a vast logistical network that seemed capable of sustaining operations indefinitely. And within that system, women were performing roles that Japanese military planners had rarely imagined possible within a modern war economy. Understanding how that system functioned and why it proved so effective requires looking at the story from several different angles. The story of wartime logistics is often told through statistics. Millions of tons of cargo, thousands of ships, endless lines of trucks, and aircraft crossing oceans and continents. But behind every movement of supplies stood people who organized the system day by day. Across the United States and the Pacific Theater, thousands of women working within the Women's Army Corps and the WAVES, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, performed the quiet administrative work that held the American supply network together. Many of them had never expected to serve in the military. Before the war, they had worked as teachers, office clerks, students, or factory employees. When the United States entered the conflict after the attack on Pearl Harbor, recruitment campaigns encouraged women to contribute to the national war effort. Some joined factories. Others chose military service. After training, many were assigned to logistics offices where the daily work rarely resembled the dramatic images of combat shown in newspapers. Instead, their days were filled with paperwork, calculations, and constant communication. Rows of desks were covered with shipping manifests and supply requests. Maps on the walls showed routes stretching across the Pacific Ocean. Colored pins marked airfields, naval bases, and cargo depots scattered across distant islands. A single request from Marine Airfield might list dozens of required items: aircraft tires, hydraulic pumps, radio components, ammunition, and medical supplies. Each request had to be reviewed, recorded, and directed toward the correct supply depot. If an aircraft squadron reported engine failures, replacement parts had to be located quickly. If a naval convoy required additional fuel reserves, tanker shipments needed to be scheduled weeks in advance. The work demanded attention to detail and patience. Errors could cause serious delays. A misfiled document or an incorrect shipping number could send equipment to the wrong destination thousands of miles away. Correcting such mistakes might take weeks in a theater where every supply movement depended on carefully timed convoys. The women working within these offices became skilled at managing the flow of information that controlled the physical movement of supplies. Their work connected factories in the United States with soldiers, sailors, and pilots stationed on distant islands. While this human network formed the administrative core of American logistics, it operated alongside an industrial system of unprecedented scale. By 1943, the United States had transformed itself into what many historians later described as the largest production machine in the world. Shipyards along the American coast produced new vessels at remarkable speed. One of the most famous examples was the Liberty ship, a cargo vessel designed for rapid construction. These ships carried everything from trucks and tanks to food and aviation fuel. Factories across the country produced aircraft in numbers that astonished observers around the world. Assembly lines turned out fighters, bombers, and transport aircraft destined for both Europe and the Pacific. Each aircraft required thousands of individual parts. Engines, instruments, weapons, tires, wiring systems, and replacement components all had to be manufactured, inspected, packed, and shipped to airfields that might be located thousands of miles away from the factories where they were built. This industrial output created an enormous logistical challenge. Producing equipment was only the first step. Every item then had to be transported through a network of railroads, warehouses, shipping ports, and supply bases before finally reaching the front lines. Within this complex chain, administrative workers, many of them women, kept records that allowed the entire system to function. Their ledgers tracked where equipment had been sent, what remained in storage, and which units were requesting additional supplies. By maintaining these records, they helped ensure that American forces rarely faced the shortages that plagued many other wartime armies. From a distance, the system appeared almost mechanical. Factories produced equipment. Ships carried it across oceans. Military units received the supplies they needed to continue fighting. But the system depended on thousands of individuals performing precise and often repetitive tasks with care. In quiet offices far from the battlefield, women helped maintain the flow of information that allowed this vast logistical machine to operate. Yet the significance of their work becomes even clearer when viewed through another perspective, the way American logistics appeared to the enemy watching from across the Pacific. To understand why the American logistical system appeared so surprising to Japanese observers, it is necessary to consider how differently the war was approached inside the military structure of Imperial Japan. Japanese military culture before and during the war placed enormous emphasis on battlefield courage, discipline, and personal sacrifice. Training manuals and officer education stressed aggressive tactics and a willingness to endure extreme hardship. Supply and logistics were certainly recognized as necessary, but they rarely received the same strategic attention given to combat operations. Japan's industrial capacity was also far smaller than that of the United States. Limited access to raw materials such as oil, aluminum, and steel meant that Japanese planners were often forced to conserve resources carefully. As the war expanded across the Pacific, Japanese supply lines became increasingly stretched. Cargo ships carried fuel and ammunition from Southeast Asia and the home islands to distant garrisons scattered across the Pacific. But the system lacked the redundancy and depth that characterized American logistics. When Japanese intelligence officers began analyzing American military operations, they noticed something unusual. Even after heavy battles, American forces seemed capable of replacing equipment quickly. Damaged aircraft were repaired or replaced. Naval task forces returned to sea with full ammunition stores. New airfields appeared on islands that had recently been captured. Reports described a constant flow of supplies moving westward across the Pacific Ocean. This flow did not appear to slow. Captured documents and reconnaissance observations revealed a vast logistical network connecting the American mainland with bases throughout the Pacific theater. Within that system were large administrative staffs responsible for planning shipments and managing inventories. Among those personnel were women serving in organizations such as the Women's Army Corps and the WAVES, women accepted for volunteer emergency service. For Japanese planners accustomed to a more traditional military structure, this detail could seem unexpected. In the United States, the war effort had mobilized nearly every part of society. Women worked not only in factories, but also in communication centers, transportation offices, and military administrative units. Their presence allowed the United States Armed Forces to allocate more male personnel to combat roles while maintaining a large and efficient logistical infrastructure. Behind this system stood a group of senior American military leaders who understood the decisive importance of supply. One of the most influential figures was George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. Marshall and his staff emphasized careful planning, coordination between services, and the efficient use of industrial resources. Another key component of the logistical system was the organization known as the U.S. Army Service Forces. This command oversaw transportation, supply distribution, construction, and maintenance across vast areas of operation. Under its authority, millions of tons of cargo moved through ports and depots every year. Within headquarters buildings and supply bases, clerks and administrators recorded the movement of equipment using large filing systems and detailed ledgers. Communication networks connected these offices to military commands across the Pacific. Radio messages, coded transmissions, and typed reports carried information between bases, allowing planners to coordinate shipping schedules and supply deliveries across thousands of miles. While modern digital systems did not yet exist, the wartime logistics network operated with remarkable efficiency through disciplined procedures and careful documentation. Ships were scheduled weeks in advance. Cargo loads were organized according to priority. Replacement parts were tracked across multiple depots. In this environment, administrative accuracy became a strategic asset. Each correct entry in a ledger helped ensure that a bomber squadron would receive spare engines on time, or that an amphibious assault force would have the equipment needed to land on a hostile shore. Gradually, the scale of this logistical system became impossible for Japanese planners to ignore. The United States was not simply fighting battles. It was sustaining a continuous flow of supplies that allowed those battles to be fought again and again across the Pacific. And by 1944, that logistical strength would begin shaping the outcome of entire campaigns. By early 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered a new phase. American forces were no longer focused only on defending distant bases. Instead, they were preparing a series of major offensives designed to move steadily westward toward the Japanese home islands. The strategy, often described by historians as island hopping, involved capturing key islands that could serve as airfields and naval bases while bypassing heavily fortified positions. Each step required overwhelming logistical preparation. In the months leading up to the campaign, supply depots across the Pacific began accumulating enormous stockpiles of equipment. Cargo ships arrived continuously at bases in Hawaii and other forward locations, unloading vehicles, ammunition, construction materials, and aviation fuel. The upcoming operations targeted the strategically important Mariana Islands. These islands, particularly Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, offered something the United States needed urgently: airfields close enough for long-range bombers to reach the Japanese home islands. But capturing these islands would require one of the largest amphibious operations yet attempted in the Pacific War. Thousands of ships and aircraft had to be prepared. Marine and Army divisions needed landing craft, engineering equipment, medical supplies, and enormous quantities of ammunition. All of it had to arrive at exactly the right place before the assault began. Behind the scenes, logistics offices in the United States and across Pacific bases worked around the clock. Within headquarters buildings in Honolulu and other command centers, clerks and administrators tracked shipments arriving from the American mainland. Cargo manifests listed every crate loaded aboard transport vessels. Every item was assigned a destination. Construction battalions needed bulldozers and steel runway mats. Fighter squadrons required spare engines and propellers. Naval forces demanded ammunition for battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that would support the landings. Much of this administrative work was handled by personnel from the Women's Army Corps and the WAVES, women accepted for volunteer emergency service. They recorded shipment numbers, prepared supply requests, and coordinated communications between depots and operational commands. A cargo ship leaving the American West Coast might carry thousands of separate items destined for multiple units. Before the vessel even left port, its cargo list had to be reviewed and approved. When it reached the Central Pacific, those supplies were redistributed again, loaded onto smaller transport vessels heading toward forward bases. The scale of the operation was immense. For the Mariana Campaign alone, American planners assembled hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of troops. Fuel reserves were stockpiled for the massive naval task forces that would protect the invasion fleet. Aircraft carriers prepared squadrons of fighters and bombers. Meanwhile, supply officers tracked every request arriving from combat units preparing for the assault. On June 15, 1944, American forces began landing on the beaches of Saipan. The invasion immediately triggered intense fighting. Japanese defenders resisted fiercely, using fortified positions and artillery to slow the advance. For several weeks, combat across the island remained brutal and difficult. But one factor steadily favored the American forces. Their supply lines remained secure. Ships continued arriving with additional ammunition, vehicles, and replacement equipment. Damaged aircraft could be repaired with spare parts delivered from distant depots. The logistical network that had been carefully organized months earlier continued functioning even while the battle unfolded. As the fighting spread across the island, it became increasingly clear that American forces possessed something the defenders could not match: a supply system capable of sustaining the offensive indefinitely. And the effects of that system would soon become even more visible as the campaign expanded across the Mariana Islands. By late June 1944, the capture of Saipan had placed the Japanese military on alert. Intelligence reports reaching Tokyo described an enemy seemingly able to replace men, weapons, and aircraft faster than they could be destroyed. The scale of American logistics was almost unimaginable. Japanese commanders, accustomed to limited resources and strict adherence to traditional hierarchies, struggled to comprehend what they observed. Airfields recently captured were operational within days. Marine divisions had armored vehicles, artillery, and ammunition ready to continue the fight immediately. Fighter squadrons that had lost aircraft in combat were receiving replacements, often within hours or days. What astonished Japanese observers most was the system's consistency. Supply lines never faltered, convoys never failed, and depots were continuously replenished. Intercepted communications revealed meticulous planning and coordination between ports, depots, and forward bases. Ships carried tons of cargo across thousands of miles of open ocean without disruption. At the heart of this network, thousands of women coordinated the flow of information. From San Francisco to Pearl Harbor and onward to the forward bases, they processed manifests, tracked shipments, and managed schedules. Each type report, ledger entry, and communication contributed directly to sustaining American forces on the front lines. The Mariana Islands campaign soon shifted the balance of power. With Tinian and Guam under American control by late July, the United States established airfields capable of supporting B-29 long-range bombers striking deep into Japanese territory. The success of these operations depended not only on combat troops, but on the unbroken flow of supplies that reached them on time, every time. Japanese military planners were forced to confront a reality they could not change. No matter how bravely soldiers fought on isolated islands, their ability to resist was constrained by limited resources, overstretched supply lines, and the constant pressure of American operations. They had underestimated the scope and efficiency of the United States logistical system. They had not anticipated that so many of its critical functions would be performed by women in administrative and operational roles. The decisive edge of the campaign was therefore less visible on the beaches or in the air. It existed in offices filled with filing cabinets, maps, and typewriters, in quiet rooms where clerks and WAC and WAVES personnel coordinated the movement of material across oceans, and in the disciplined procedures that allowed shipments to arrive precisely when needed. As the Mariana Islands campaign concluded, Japanese forces faced an unrelenting adversary. American troops pressed westward, supported by supply lines that could not be broken. Each new offensive benefited from the same system. Ammunition and fuel arrived, aircraft were replaced, and landing craft were available for the next assault. The human element behind this achievement, thousands of women meticulously tracking, planning, and coordinating every movement, was invisible to the enemy, yet crucial to the outcome. By mid-1944, the realization was clear. The war in the Pacific was no longer simply a battle of weapons and soldiers. It was a contest of sustained capability. The United States' ability to project force across thousands of miles, continuously resupply combat units, and maintain operational tempo was decisive. And at the center of this system were the women whose work ensured that fleets, air squadrons, and armies could operate without interruption. The success of the Mariana Campaign and the lessons learned by both sides set the stage for the next phase of the Pacific War. Operations in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would all rely on the same logistical foundation. The enemy's shock and disbelief at the role of women in sustaining these operations was not mere curiosity. It highlighted the profound impact that a well-organized supply network could have on modern warfare. The scene was set for the aftermath, a transformation in both the conduct of war and the recognition of contributions behind the front lines. By the end of 1944, the Mariana Islands campaign had delivered a decisive blow to Japanese defensive capabilities. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were firmly in American hands. Airfields constructed on these islands allowed long-range bombers to reach targets in the Japanese home islands for the first time, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape of the Pacific War. The Japanese military found itself increasingly constrained. Supplies were scarce. Ships and aircraft were lost faster than they could be replaced. Frontline units on remote islands faced shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food. The operational tempo of Japanese forces slowed, and their capacity to reinforce or counterattack weakened. Meanwhile, the United States maintained a relentless pace. Supply convoys continued to depart from San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle, transporting thousands of tons of equipment, fuel, and provisions. At each stop along the chain, from Hawaii to forward bases, personnel, including thousands of women in the Women's Army Corps and the Waves, ensured that every shipment reached its intended destination efficiently. The success of these operations demonstrated a profound shift in modern warfare. Victory was no longer determined solely by combat prowess. It was equally dependent on sustaining forces across vast distances. Logistics became a decisive factor, and the American model highlighted the value of thorough planning, redundancy, and disciplined administration. Japanese observers, including intelligence officers, marveled at the scale of the operation. They noted the speed with which airfields were built and supplied, the continual replacement of lost aircraft, and the ability of the United States to maintain operational pressure far from its mainland. Many reports expressed astonishment that women were central to managing these complex supply networks, a reality that challenged conventional assumptions about gender roles in military operations. The effectiveness of these logistical efforts allowed the United States to conduct successive amphibious assaults with minimal disruption. Marine and Army units were never left waiting for critical supplies, and naval forces could sustain prolonged operations across thousands of miles. The Pacific Theater became a testament to the fact that organization, planning, and administration could shape the outcome of battles even before the first shots were fired. The Mariana Campaign also had psychological effects. Japanese soldiers and commanders recognized that American forces were able to replace losses continuously. Morale on isolated islands began to deteriorate as defenders realized that each tactical victory could be offset by a larger operational advantage sustained by a well-managed supply network. At the same time, within the United States, the contributions of women to logistics were increasingly appreciated. While often unseen, their work had directly influenced the success of complex operations. Without their precise planning, meticulous record-keeping, and coordination across thousands of miles, the Mariana Islands Campaign and subsequent offensives would have been far more difficult to execute. This moment marked a turning point not only in the Pacific War, but also in the recognition of the indispensable role of administrative and logistical personnel. The United States had demonstrated that modern warfare required more than combat units. It required an entire network of support capable of sustaining operations indefinitely. As the Pacific War continued into 1945, the lessons of the Mariana Campaign and the logistical operations behind it became evident across all levels of the United States military. Supply chains, once considered secondary to combat operations, were now recognized as a central factor in strategic planning. The smooth operation of these networks enabled amphibious assaults on the Philippines, the grueling battle for Iwo Jima, and eventually the assault on Okinawa. Each offensive relied on the same principles: meticulous organization, redundancy, and the precise coordination of personnel, equipment, and communication across thousands of miles. Among the most remarkable aspects of this system was the role of women. From clerks and typists to officers in the Women's Army Corps and the Waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service. Women ensured the constant flow of material, managed transportation schedules, and maintained the complex web of information linking depots, ports, and combat units. Their work remained largely invisible to the public and often overshadowed by headlines of battles and heroics. Yet military historians later recognized that their contributions were essential to sustaining American operations across the vast Pacific theater. After the surrender of Japan in August 1945, reports and assessments highlighted the importance of logistics in achieving victory. American military planners praised the efficiency of supply chains and the ingenuity of personnel who had maintained them under constant pressure. Testimonies from commanding officers emphasize that sustained operations in the Pacific would have been impossible without the reliable coordination of shipments, fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts. The post-war period also marked a shift in the perception of women in military service. While combat roles remained restricted, women increasingly took on responsibilities in administration, logistics, and technical specialties. Their wartime experience demonstrated that large-scale military operations could not function without their participation. Policies evolved to integrate women more fully into permanent roles within the U.S. Armed Forces, setting the stage for future generations. From a strategic standpoint, the Pacific campaigns revealed a broader truth. Industrial and administrative capacity could directly determine the outcome of modern warfare. The ability to sustain combat operations over extended distances, to replace losses, and to maintain morale and readiness depended on an infrastructure managed with precision and foresight. The Mariana Islands campaign was not just a battle of bullets and bombs. It was a demonstration of how a nation could leverage organization, human capital, and foresight to gain an insurmountable advantage. For Japanese forces, the lessons were sobering. Even the most determined defense could not overcome an enemy capable of maintaining an endless flow of reinforcements and supplies. Observers noted that logistical superiority often compensated for numerical or tactical shortcomings, a factor that would influence post-war military thought in both Japan and the United States. Ultimately, the work of women in logistics was a quiet revolution within the war. They proved that effective administration, disciplined coordination, and unrelenting attention to detail could influence the outcome of conflicts just as decisively as frontline engagements. Their contributions reshaped not only the course of the Pacific War, but also the understanding of what modern military success truly required. The stage was now set for reflection on the broader significance of these efforts, connecting the human, industrial, and strategic threads into a calm, philosophical understanding of their impact on history and warfare. War is often measured in victories, casualties, and the shifting lines on a map. Yet, the story of the Pacific War reminds us that battles are sustained by forces that remain largely invisible. The networks of people, planning, and organization that ensure armies, navies, and air forces can continue to operate over vast distances. In the United States, this network included thousands of women whose contributions, though rarely seen on the front lines, were indispensable. They managed supply depots, coordinated shipping schedules, tracked inventories, and ensured that soldiers, sailors, and airmen received the equipment and provisions they needed. Each ledger entry, each typed report, and each careful calculation kept the machinery of war running smoothly, often across thousands of miles of ocean. The shock and disbelief this generated among Japanese commanders was not simply a reaction to efficiency. It was a confrontation with an unexpected reality. A modern military could not rely solely on combat prowess. It required meticulous organization, foresight, and an unbroken chain of support. The role of women in sustaining these operations demonstrated how societal mobilization and human ingenuity could redefine the meaning of strategic advantage. Looking back, the Mariana Islands campaign and the broader Pacific logistics effort illustrate a timeless lesson. Victory in war is as much about the systems behind the fighting as it is about the fighting itself. The quiet, disciplined labor of thousands of individuals shaped the outcome of battles, enabled new strategic possibilities, and accelerated the collapse of enemy defenses. Beyond the historical facts lies a human truth. Courage and dedication are not limited to the battlefield. In offices filled with typewriters, ledgers, and shipping manifests, women contributed to one of the largest, most complex operations the world had ever seen. Their work reminds us that every conflict, no matter how vast, depends on people whose efforts, though unseen, carry the weight of history. The Pacific War was won not only by soldiers storming beaches or pilots striking from the sky, but also by the steady, relentless hands ensuring that the tools of war reached those who needed them. In that sense, The contributions of women in logistics stand as a testament to the hidden forces that shape history, proving that the machinery of war is powered as much by thought and planning as by courage and fire.